Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do another random entry here, once again focusing on one of the lesser known mafioso gangsters. In fact, when I was reading this information, I realized that this is just a picture-perfect example of someone that was through and through throughout his entire career, if you could call it that, up until the very last moments of his life, a true mafioso gangster. This was someone that was a contract killer, he was a murderer, he was someone that was involved in so many illegal activities associated with the mafia that if you looked up the definition, this was the guy that would be there in a picture right by that definition. And in fact, this was someone that, based on all of his heinous activities, just absolutely vicious attitude, if he was still alive today, I probably wouldn't even be doing this particular video here. This was something else that I would probably just hold off on the side until later on. But it has to do with this. You're looking at a picture of him now. His full name was Frank Abbandando, but as always, he had a nickname, and in this case, it was known as the Dasher. More on that here in a minute, because apparently that nickname really had nothing to do with his mafioso activities. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the information associated with this gangster, and then that way I'll get to showcase how he was through and through someone from the mafia to the very last moments of his life. So who was this Frank Abbandando? Well, he was someone that was actually born here in the U.S., here in New York, on July 11th, 1910. So many of the mafioso gangsters, especially those from the early 1900s, I frequently talk about them immigrating from another location. His parents actually did so. Lorenzo Abbandando and Rosaria Famighetti, they immigrated from Abbandando, Italy. But when they were here in New York City to be specific, that's when they had him there. He was actually one of 12 children altogether. Big family, in other words. But of those 12, 7 did not make it. And he was one of them that did survive and then eventually grew up in that prime area there near the Brooklyn, near some of the other areas associated with the mobsters, and that became his area to essentially blossom as someone in this type of career. In fact, little information is known about his childhood years, but at least going into a teenager status, he was already doing illegal activities. In fact, he was extorting money from shop owners by threatening to torch their shops. Can you believe that? This was someone that was already at such a young age basically going up to these shops and telling them, if you don't pay me this type of money, then I'm going to go ahead and torch this place. He was already someone that was doing this type of activity, so that by the time he reached his 20s, there was no hesitation in him joining street gangs, and he became known as a street gang in an area by the Ocean Hill section of Brooklyn, and that's where he started really going into more and more activities. In fact, he organized gambling, he did rackets for the gang, he did loan sharking, and it was eventually at this time period that he did his most famous work, which was involved murders. In fact, he was eventually going to do contract murders. More on that here in a minute, but at least starting with that gang, that's essentially where he began doing those type of murders, and he was not scared of any police at all. In fact, in 1928, he actually beat up a New York police officer, and he was sent to school. So even doing this type of vicious crime, he was still just sent to a reform school, maybe as a way to try to change him, quote unquote change him. But it was here that he instead just passed the time actually just doing sports, and he was able to excel in baseball. In fact, he became so well at baseball at this school that his nickname was the Dasher. So remember I was mentioning a minute ago how his nickname had nothing to do with anything associated with his mafioso gangster type activities. Well, here it was. He was essentially someone that was really good at playing baseball, and then that's why he became known as the Dasher. But once he was out, once again, that he was roaming the neighborhoods, once again, of Ocean Hill and in the neighborhood of Brownsville, continuing to do his very bad activities. He also did this, which just adds a whole other level. He was a sexual predator. He was someone that was frequently going out, trying to find women to rape, and when he did so, he apparently did it by the dozens. In fact, there was one woman that apparently he did not rape, and he told an officer that the only reason why that was because of this. He said, well, that one doesn't really count because I married that girl later. So essentially, that's who he ended up marrying, and that's how he treated that person, at least with regards to that. So it goes to show again the mindset that this guy had. He was torching shops, or threatening to torch them. He was committing loan sharking and gambling and extortion rackets. He was also doing murders. He was beating up police officers. All of this, and by his early 20s, he was basically doing all of this. And on top of that, he was going around raping women as well. And then finally, by the early 1930s, that's when things changed within the New York Mafia. The five families decided they wanted to keep things on the down low when it came to their murders. They realized that a lot of the stuff they were doing was making headline news. This is not good for business. This is not good for money or their criminal enterprise. So they decided to shift their mindset into a different format. And the way they would do it is this. They would actually still continue to do killings whenever necessary, but this time they would actually do contract killings. And it was by this point that this guy, the Dasher, Frank Abbandando, was also part of an infamous gang that I've talked about within some of my other past videos, Murder Inc. So once again, that's the loose cabal, that loose organization of predominantly Italian Americans, and then also Jewish Americans, and then also Irishmen. They were all there working together of sorts, making sure that their activities, that their skills, especially as murderers, could be used by these five families. And he in turn was doing very, very well when it came to that. He was able to use these five families to create this type of activity. It caused him to grow not just himself when it came to the contract killings, but he also formed another network of killers, if you could believe that, into 250 criminals. And they all together basically started working to ensure that they could do whatever the five families were needing, but also doing other things involving narcotics, involving labor unions, involving prostitution, and so on. So he was absolutely excelling in this, not just because, again, there was no limitation. Like in this case, even if you weren't Italian or Italian American, it was perfectly fine. You could easily just get along with the others and then do this type of activity. But it was because he was known as someone that favored, in terms of his contract killing, one form of attack, and that was this. He was known to take an ice pick and then stab his victims pretty much straight through the heart. It goes to show again the savageness associated with this guy, with this Dasher. He was absolutely someone that could take an ordinary device like that, an ordinary ice pick, and then turn it into a murderer's row of killings here and there. And that's what he was doing throughout this time period. And then finally, he assisted in one murder of a guy by the name of George Rudnick, who was a loan shark in Brooklyn. This guy was hired because there was another guy by the name of Relis, who stated, his name was Abe Relis, who stated that George Rudnick was potentially a police informant. There was not 100% concrete proof because Abe Relis had received the information that he was a police informant, but who knows if that was 100% true. Either way, though, this guy, Frank Abbandando, took an ice pick and a meat cleaver, and then maybe some other, and also a few other gang members, and then they went and they strangled George Rudnick. They stabbed him 63 times, and then inside a garage, they crushed his head as well to finally end things. I don't know exactly how they crushed his head. I don't know if they used like a giant toolbox or if they used another device, maybe even the dreaded vice. You know how you've seen that in Casino, right? When it comes to that infamous scene, who knows? But as far as George Rudnick, that was the murder that would eventually lead Frank Abbandando to face a reckoning later on. More on that just here in one moment. But yes, eventually things just continued throughout the 1930s. The Murder Inc. was continuing to excel when it came to their contract killings and their work for hires. However, by the 1940s, things began to go downhill for them. This was because a lot of the top leaders associated with Murder Inc. were eventually getting captured. And in fact, it turns out Abe Relis, the guy again that I just mentioned a minute ago, had hired Frank Abbandando to kill that guy that was named George Rudnick, the one there in the garage. He actually turned state informant. He was captured. He was told he was going to give a deal. He took the deal, and in his deal, he was in turn turn going to rat and inform on other people, and that included, in that case, Frank Abbandando. He was able to tell law enforcement, he was able to tell people prosecuting in certain cases, everything associated with that murder. And so Frank Abbandando was put on trial, but he was so absolutely confident that he was going to get away scot-free, either maybe through intimidation or good old bribery when it came to the mafia, that he even whispered, he dared to do this, he whispered a threat to the actual judge while he was there on the witness stand. Can you believe that? He did all this right there in the courtroom. But he was convicted, but as it turns out, something else happened afterward that caused that conviction to overturn on appeal. But one more time, in this case in April 1941, he was put on trial again, a second time. So it looks like in this case, the state was able to present things one more time, maybe new evidence. And when this happened, he indeed was convicted a final time of first-degree murder of this guy, the one that he killed earlier, George Rudnick, there in the garage. And he was sentenced to death. He was sentenced to death in the infamous Sing Sing prison. And not only that, but a year later, in February 19th, 1942, he was ultimately executed by Old Sparky. You've heard about Old Sparky, right? That electric chair that sent so many people convicted to death straight to their death. This was the infamous electric chair that is also apparently very, very haunted. But yes, and up to those final moments, it was said that Dasher himself, Frank Abbandando, took those moments to continue to curse the guards, to basically be in a bravado showmanship type mode. He mocked everyone that was around him. He displayed absolutely no fear. He had this weird, morbid humor as he was being led up to the electric chair. And then finally, when he was turned on, that was it. He absolutely was fried. He was executed. And then that was the end of Frank Abbandando. So I was mentioning earlier at the beginning of the video, this was a guy that was through and through up until the very last moments of his life, a mafioso gangster. That shows an example right there. Even up to the final moments, he was not sorry for anything that he did. He absolutely enjoyed his entire moments, everything that he did as far as his criminal activities, no remorse whatsoever. And then finally he was executed up until those few moments. And if you can believe this too, it looks like it runs in the family. His brother Rocco, at the funeral or at the mass associated with his death, assaulted a news photographer as well. Who knows what had happened to cause that assault, but it seems like that same hot-headedness ran through the family. And then he was buried in a plot there in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York City. So if you wanted to meet one of the most infamous mafioso gangsters there, one of the most famous contract killers, at least when it came to the many people that he killed. In fact, it's been said that there's a good chance he would have killed at least over, was it 30 people? Somewhere around there. And those are the ones that, again, are known as far as his killings. There's still all the other ones that he may not have not have been reported. You can go to that cemetery, and then that's where you'll see him there to this day. But if anybody else has any more information, anything else I might have missed, then please post those comments below. Anybody have a chance, in fact, to go to that cemetery, St. John Cemetery in Queens, New York City? If so, you might have a chance to see that actual gravesite. And then you'll get to see, again, one of the most infamous contract killers associated within the world of the mafia. But again, any more information someone has, then please post those comments below. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.